1,000 feet and climbing.
A brand new 737 takes off during an intense storm.
They should be there by now.
And then mysteriously falls from the sky over West Africa.
Those who operate these type of aircraft, they have the same question: what happened? What happened in Cameroon?
Investigators scour the crash site for clues.
The ground over there.
This was the toughest accident scene I've been on in my career.
But look at this.
When the investigators review the flight data,
We're crashing!
they discover there was an inexplicable fight for control in the cockpit.
Left! Left! Left direction! Who flies like that?
In Douala, Cameroon, Kenya Airways Flight 507 is almost an hour behind schedule.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to wait for the weather conditions to improve before we take off.
A severe storm must pass before the pilots can depart. There are 108 impatient passengers on board. Many need to catch connecting flights. Flight 507 began in Abidjan earlier in the day. It's now bound for Nairobi, Kenya.
507 was a very common flight for Kenya Airways, particularly last decade. The amount of traffic from East Africa to West Africa has really increased, partially because there's much more business going on.
The Boeing 737NG, recently acquired by Kenya Airways, is the newest generation of twin-engine commercial jets.
This was a new era of aviation in Africa, where airlines, and particularly the bigger ones, invest in brand new aircraft.
Captain Francis Wamwea is in command of tonight's flight. He's an experienced pilot with more than 8,000 hours in the cockpit. Andrew Kiru is his first officer. The young pilot joined Kenya Airways a year ago.
Let's see what this storm is doing.
The pilots use the 737's onboard weather radar to monitor the storm.
Looks like there might be a way around it.
Now that the storm has moved off the end of the runway, Captain Wamwea believes he can fly past it.
It's quite common that the weather may be a factor in delay in Africa because of its severity, so it's not in that respect a surprise for the operator to find this kind of weather at that time of the night.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup.
Okay, 507. Startup approved.
Startup checklist. Quickly, please. Generators on.
A few minutes before midnight, Flight 507 is finally ready for takeoff.
Okay. Request taxi clearance. Kenya 507 requesting taxi clearance.
Taxi runway 12, Kenya 507.
Taxi runway 12.
Kenya 507. Put on the wipers. Right is clear.
The crew taxis to the runway. There's one flight ahead of them, Royal Air Maroc Flight 287.
Royal Air Maroc 287.
87, in position. Runway 12, latest weather, please.
Visibility 800 meters. Wind calm. Rain, moderate thunderstorms.
All right.
287. Clear for takeoff.
The Royal Air Maroc flight departs without incident.
Wait till we line up.
Okay. Usually, things happen quickly, though.
Okay. Try to keep up.
Captain Wanwea double-checks the storm's position
Let's have a look.
and confirms the route around the lingering storm cell.
Tower, Kenya 507.
After departure, we would like to maintain a heading.
Slightly left of the runway, due to weather ahead. Right. Sorry, slightly right.
Just after the aircraft took off, the plan was to make a small turn to the right to avoid the most active weather cells that they saw on the weather radar in front of them.
Approved.
Okay. All done.
Ladies and gentlemen, a kind reminder to ensure your seatbelts are well fastened for takeoff. Cabin crew to your seats. Okay. Takeoff thrust is set. Speed building on board. Check. 80 knots. Check. V1. Rotate.
Just after midnight, Kenya Airways Flight 507 finally departs for Nairobi.
You're up.
Okay. $1,000 feet and climbing.
Heading select.
Selected. Check.
The 737 starts turning right to avoid the storm.
N1.
Okay, command.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yep.
$2,400 feet and climbing.
Now we're getting into it. Allah!
Bank angle, bank angle.
Suddenly, the 737 rolls dangerously to the right.
Allah!
Bank angle, bank,
The captain fights to level the plane,
bank angle, bank angle.
but it continues banking further and further right.
Bank angle, bank angle.
Despite the pilot's efforts, they keep rolling.
Bank angle, bank angle.
Now we are crashing. Left!
Bank
Left!
angle, bank angle.
Left direction!
Marine, bank angle, bank angle.
Five hours later, the controller in Douala is ending his shift.
Dula Tower. No reason I can think of. They should be there by now.
Kenya Airways Flight 507 should have landed in Nairobi 45 minutes ago, but the plane has still not arrived.
Sure.
And no one even knows where to start looking for it. Kenya Airways Flight 507 was due in Nairobi at 6:15 a.m. local time. But it never arrived. By morning, news of the missing 737 has spread. Families and friends of the passengers want to know where their loved ones are. Engelbert Zawa Etundi worked for Cameroon's Civil Aviation Authority.
When I first heard that an aircraft was missing, I immediately thought we were going to have a catastrophe on our hands.
2 days later, search teams finally locate the wreckage of Kenya 507. It's 3.5 miles southeast of Douala Airport. The 737 has crashed into a mangrove swamp and is submerged in mud and water. There are no survivors.
As a nation, we are united in grief with the 20...
It's a tragic turn of events. Victims' friends and family are demanding answers from the Cameroonian government. But the government has a problem.
Cameroon did not have an agency in charge of air accident investigations.
Investigators from several countries descend on Cameroon. Since the Boeing 737 is manufactured in the United States, Dennis Jones from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, joins the investigation.
The fact that it was a relatively new airplane at the time certainly made it a little bit more compelling. But all around the world, those who operate these type of aircraft, they have the same question: what happened? What happened in Cameroon?
It's all from the tail.
Looks like everything else is down in there.
I saw a lot of debris from the tail section. We were not able to see the wreckage itself because particularly we were in a swamp, and that was another challenge throughout the whole process.
A technical advisor for Boeing, Mark Smith, also joins the team of investigators.
This was the toughest accident scene I've been on in my career at Boeing. We're standing there looking around at the devastation, the destruction. So we have to, as a team, start working on what happened to it. Where are the various pieces?
A key piece of evidence is quickly found: the 737's flight data recorder.
Well, looks pretty good, considering.
The FDR is sent to Canada's Transportation Safety Board to be downloaded. While searchers continue looking for the cockpit voice recorder, investigators try to determine what caused the plane to crash so soon after takeoff.
The airport is only 3.5 miles away. They can't have been in the air more than 2 minutes.
We really didn't have a clue.
You're looking for explanations. We were able to start doing a lot of on-scene examination, documentation, and trying to get an idea how it impacted the ground.
The layout of the wreckage tells investigators how the plane was flying on impact.
Completely obliterated.
So I haven't found the most of it.
Looks like it came in hard and fast.
When you have a high-speed impact like that at a nose-down attitude, you usually get extensive fragmentation of aircraft.
Well, actually, what we're trying to do is estimate, if we can, an angle and maybe even a speed of impact to try and get a feel for what happened. Because once again, we don't yet have the FDR data.
How deep does this go?
more than 15 feet.
No, definitely hit nose first. And hard.
So, was there some kind of loss of control that took place? That was what was kind of foremost on my mind.
While they wait for the flight data, investigators turn to the controller on duty that night to help fill in some blanks.
What can you tell me about that night?
The first thing is that they delayed their takeoff.
Really? How come?
There was a storm coming in from the east.
Tower 507. We are going to wait for the storm to pass. Canceling startup.
Roger 507, canceling startup.
The storm could last all night, but visibility should improve.
The airplane was on the tarmac, loaded, ready to go, waiting for the weather to clear, and then they would take off.
But 20 minutes later, they decide to take off. Why?
It cleared a bit, and they were going to try to get around it.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup.
Okay, 507. Startup approved.
The controller explains how the crew plan to fly to the right of the storm. Is it possible the crew misjudged the storm's size and strength? NTSB investigator Bill Bramble also joins the team.
They had a cell 8 miles off the end of the runway, so the crew was using their own radar to decide how to maneuver around the cell.
Here's a meteorological report from that night.
Thunderstorm and rain over the airport with winds gusting up to 20 knots. But it was starting to clear.
Investigators wonder if the wind and rain were still severe enough to bring down a 737.
He asked permission from the controller to go around the storm. To the right.
Maybe the storm was worse than he thought.
There was a weather delay for several flights. KQ 507 was one of 4 flights that were delayed on the ground for about an hour.
Investigators need to speak to other pilots who took off from Douala that night. How intense was the storm once they were in the air?
I will speak to one of the pilots tomorrow.
Investigators interview a pilot who departed immediately after Kenya Airways Flight 507. They need to find out if he had any difficulty avoiding the storm.
The flight crews solely depended on their own onboard systems to understand what they were getting into. There was no assistance from the ATC.
So, no problems at all? Not even mild turbulence?
He said that the weather was smooth after they took off. They did the same thing, too. They took off and turned to the right, too, to circumnavigate the weather.
Okay. And thank you for your time.
Investigators conclude the pilots could have maneuvered around the storm on their flight path.
Set.
With weather ruled out, the team wonders if there was a mechanical issue with the brand new 737.
This was important because it was the first for the 800 series, and if there's an accident and it's not immediately understood what the problem is, it's really important to get to the bottom of it.
Technicians in Canada have been able to extract the FDR data.
Let's see what we've got.
They read the data out. Altitude, airspeed, bank angle, pitch attitude, those sorts of things. Once you plot those out, you can start seeing what occurred.
Any malfunction warnings during the flight would provide an important clue.
There might have been some kind of mechanical issue that might have popped up.
No warnings.
They find no signs of any system failure.
The data showed us the airplane was behaving as we would expect it to. It was a perfectly airworthy aircraft. There's no question about it.
As the team continues looking through the data,
but look at this.
They discover that just over a minute into the flight, a different kind of alert did go off.
Bank angle alert at an altitude of 2,800 feet.
For investigators, this is their first real clue about what happened to Flight 507. Any roll exceeding 35 degrees is considered extreme. Once reaching that angle, a warning alerts pilots of danger.
Rotate.
When investigators review the pilot's inputs after takeoff, they make a critical discovery.
Gear up.
Okay.
He was turning left from the moment they left the ground.
That information showed us that right after takeoff, the aircraft started to roll to the right a little bit, and the pilot corrected it.
And then he keeps making corrections to the left.
Looks like he's trying to keep the plane level.
But what caused the slow roll to the right in the first place?
Bingo. It's the way the flaps are rigged. Give it a slight right roll.
The aircraft had a tendency to roll to the right.
The flaps increase a plane's lift at slower speeds. On this particular airplane, the left flap provided slightly more lift than the right one.
It's similar to driving down the freeway in your car and just letting go of the wheel. If I was to do that, then it'll start to drift off one way or another. That's the way the airplane was slowly and naturally banking it.
This discovery explains why the captain kept his control column turned to the left immediately after takeoff.
Well, that's weird.
But it doesn't explain an even more puzzling element of the flight data.
Look at this. The captain's control wheel inputs seem to stop. It's like he just let go of it. 6 degrees right, he does nothing. 11 degrees. 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and still nothing.
As the plane's bank angle approached 35 degrees, neither pilot took action to stop the increasingly dangerous roll.
Bank angle,
Until the bank angle warning sounded.
bank angle.
And then he does this. Right, left, right again, left again.
In the last moments of the flight, we noticed an erratic movement of the control column that didn't make any sense.
For 16 seconds after the bank angle warning, the aircraft continued its dangerous roll.
The airplane just continues to roll right up to 110 degrees of bank. The crew didn't recover it before impact.
The data paints a baffling picture of the 1.5-minute flight.
Who flies like that?
And that was puzzling to us. So it really highlighted that we needed more information, needed more data. And that data is the CVR. The CVR is what tells us the conversation, what might they have been looking at.
But after weeks of searching the crash site, there's still no sign of the cockpit voice recorder. It's been more than a month since the crash of Kenya Airways Flight 507. And the cockpit voice recorder has still not been found.
Over there.
We spent days scouring the site, up track, down track, everywhere, looking for the CVR, trying to find it.
The team now uses a tracking device to scan the swamp for a signal from the box. Five weeks after the crash, the cockpit voice recorder is finally recovered.
That was a very, very exciting time for everyone involved with the recovery, as well as the investigation group itself for having that information.
Okay, let's start on the ground.
Started.
Investigators hope the recording will explain why the pilots let their plane bank so dangerously to the right.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup. Okay, 507. Startup approved. Okay. Request taxi clearance.
They hope the recording will also explain how they ended up spiraling into a swamp.
1,000 feet and climbing. Heading select.
Okay, this is where he stops making any inputs.
Selected. Check. L1. Okay, command.
That's the call to activate the autopilot.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yup.
After calling for the autopilot to be engaged, Captain Wamwea released the control column, trusting the autopilot to fly the plane. But there's a problem.
The autopilot didn't come on.
He thought the 737 was flying itself.
There was nobody flying the controls, so nothing was controlling the airplane.
The discovery changes the course of the entire investigation.
N1.
Okay, Commander.
Why didn't the autopilot come on?
The captain calls for the autopilot to be engaged. But the first officer does not respond.
The procedure should be for the first officer to push the button and say, the autopilot engaged.
Okay, Commander.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yep.
Investigators believe the first officer was so focused on inputting the route around the storm that he failed to engage the autopilot.
2,400 feet and climbing.
Now we're getting into it.
Meanwhile, the captain assumed the autopilot was engaged and controlling the pre-selected right turn. The pilots only noticed a problem when the bank angle warning went off.
Bank angle, bank angle.
It's pretty clear the captain expected the autopilot to be engaged, and it didn't get engaged. And then neither crew member picked up the fact that it wasn't engaged.
We're crashing! Yo-yo crashing! Left! Left! Left direction!
Why did neither crew member take the critical step of engaging the autopilot?
Standard operating procedures provide a safety net for crews, but if crews don't adhere to the standard operating procedures, they lose that protection.
They comb through Kenya Airways procedures to see who has responsibility for activating the autopilot.
Anything?
Yeah, from what I can tell, it's not really clear who is supposed to do it. All it specifies is turn on when above minimum altitude for engagement. It's not very helpful.
It wasn't really clear in the standard operating procedures of when the autopilot does come on, who's responsible for doing that and what the response should be to that.
Recovering from a 35-degree bank is not a complicated procedure. The bank angle warning is designed to give pilots enough time to react. But for some reason, this crew wasn't able to do that. The team digs into their records.
This is what we have on one way.
Lots of experience. 16 years as a pilot, most of those on the 737.
Let's see what this storm is doing.
The captain had been a flight attendant for Kenya Airways years and years ago, and then went to flight school and got his ratings and transitioned into the role of pilot.
Wait. Look at this.
But the captain's training records reveal serious shortcomings.
Inadequate knowledge of systems and procedures, insufficient flight discipline, poor cockpit scans. Below standard. Yikes.
Get up.
Okay.
We discovered the captain had a history of training difficulties and lack of systems knowledge for autoflight systems and so forth. So he had some red flags in his history.
The first officer's report isn't any better.
Failed to monitor autopilot when engaged.
V1. Rotate.
The first officer was young and fairly inexperienced. He only had a little over 800 hours of flight time, and he had some training feedback that involved things like you need to be more proactive about calling out deviations and so forth.
Not an A-level crew.
We're crashing! Left correction!
Bank angle.
Did a lack of skills in the cockpit doom the 108 passengers on board the flight? Investigators need to determine if pilot error caused the horrific crash of Kenya Airways Flight 507.
Okay, Allah. He's definitely surprised. Then 22 degrees to the right, 20 left, 45 right, then 11 to the left. That's not helping.
When the bank warning came on and the aircraft was on a right roll, the first response was the captain turned it further to the right, and which aggravated the situation.
Now the bank angle is approaching 50 degrees.
As the situation grew worse after the bank angle warning and the confusion amongst the crew, the autopilot does engage, and the captain pushed that button.
The team discovers that when the captain finally realized the autopilot was not engaged, he activated it. But when it didn't immediately level the plane, the captain turned the control column erratically, an action which overrode the autopilot.
We're crashing!
Yeah, we are crashing.
Then yes, we are crashing. Left, left, left correction.
So now one's trying to turn left while the other turns to the right. They're fighting each other's inputs.
Left! Left! Left correction!
Bank angle. Bank angle.
I don't get it. It should have been a simple recovery.
The back and forth was trying to do corrective actions, but it didn't seem like it was correcting anything.
He's already banked over to the right, 34 or 35 degrees. Why would he roll further? Well, that's the question we have to answer right there.
Investigators use a Boeing simulator to recreate the final stages of the flight.
From the simulator, you can literally put yourself in the driver's seat and reconstruct the flight and be there at the pilot to be able to determine whether we can recover.
Can we give it a 50-degree right bank, please? Activate the autopilot, please.
Exactly what it's supposed to do. The roll is slowing.
And the inputs we discussed.
Right, left, right. Jeez. There goes the autopilot. Bank angle's increasing again.
Bank angle, bank angle.
The simulation shows that if the captain had given the autopilot enough time to take control, the 737 would have returned to a relatively safe bank angle. But his erratic inputs prevented that from happening.
If only he'd done nothing.
It was determined that recovery was still an option just a few seconds before impact, really.
Investigators are puzzled. Why wasn't the experienced captain able to execute such a straightforward recovery?
Was there something here that we were missing in the investigation that may have confused the crew? And so we started looking harder at the possibility of spatial disorientation.
From the simulator?
Yeah.
Just darkness outside. No reference at all.
It was a completely black view out the windshield. If you look up out the windshield, you have no ground reference that could immediately have helped you straighten the airplane out.
Spatial disorientation is an inability to distinguish up from down, left from right. It has been known to hinder judgment and delay response times.
We're crashing! Yeah, we are crashing! Left! Left! Left direction!
Only the first officer seemed to assess the situation correctly.
First thing he says is, yeah, we are crashing. It took him 10 seconds to speak up.
When the bank angle alert went off, there wasn't much discussion about what was happening until the captain said, "We're crashing."
Yeah, we are crashing!
And the first officer didn't say anything until he said that.
Left direction!
The team listens to the recording of the first leg of the flight from Abidjan to Douala. They are looking for clues as to why the first officer remained silent.
Let's hear it.
What is wrong with you?
What they hear shocks them. When investigators listen to the cockpit voice recording of the first leg of Kenya Airways Flight 507...
Sorry, did you say an altitude of 14,000 feet? Yes. Don't be so stupid. Write it down if you can't remember.
Wow.
They're stunned by how the captain treated his first officer.
It was pretty bad. The captain was sort of browbeating the first officer. There were words like stupid, shut up, stuff like that you wouldn't expect to hear in a professional crew environment.
What is wrong with you? Did you not hear the instruction? Heading 230. Understand?
The first officer seemed to kind of shut down.
Heading 230. Understand?
He was, at a certain point, sort of reduced to responding with these sort of monosyllabic grunts.
Investigators suspect this might explain why the first officer took so long to speak up.
The captain's behavior toward the first officer on the first flight likely caused him to adopt sort of a passive role. You need both pilots actively engaged in checking each other and catching errors, and if one pilot adopts a passive role, they're going to be less effective.
So, heightened ego.
Captain Wamwia's treatment of his first officer leads investigators to examine his professional history more closely.
Can you tell me more information?
We spent a lot of time going through pilot records, interviewing other flight crew members.
Were there any?
Yes.
They quickly learned that the captain's shortcomings were not limited to his flying abilities.
Okay.
He had a lot of concerning things in his training files about being overbearing, being authoritarian in terms of how he dealt with other crew members.
So, we have a young, reserved first officer and an overbearing captain.
This accident is kind of a throwback to those early days where we were focused on the issues of overly assertive, authoritarian, overbearing captains and submissive, inadequately assertive junior first officers.
A lethal combination.
Investigators conclude the bad pairing in this flight crew set in motion a sequence of events that led to the crash.
As an investigator, all of these accidents I've worked, it's very clear there is never a single cause. It's always a chain of events.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yup.
A deadly combination of poor pilot performance and spatial disorientation contributed to the accident.
All the risk factors were present. There was distraction, there was reduced outside visibility, and there was confusion.
But in the end, investigators conclude that one major mistake triggered the entire tragedy.
N1.
Okay, Commander.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yep.
It was the crew's failure to ensure the autopilot was turned on.
Bank angle. Bank angle.
That ultimately led to the death of 114 people.
We're crashing!
In the aftermath of Flight 507's crash, Cameroon's Commission of Inquiry makes a series of recommendations, including the regular update of safety manuals related to cockpit procedure and crew responsibility.
They made changes to the standard operating procedures about who's responsible for engaging the autopilot, and that was very key.
And improved pilot training with a focus on upset recovery.
One technology that Boeing has tested and developed and is looking at putting into its airplanes is a roll recovery arrow, so that if you're at an unusual angle of bank, the attitude display will actually show you which direction you need to roll the airplane and provide an accompanying oral.
In the end, you have to look at training, crew makeup, all adding into all the links of chain, the chain that caused this to happen this night.
Let's see what this storm is doing.
And those who are not familiar with accident investigation think that all the answers are at the crash site. It's rarely at the crash site. And that's exactly what happened.
Rotate.